In recent weeks, Russian military commanders across multiple sectors of the Ukrainian front have issued coordinated retreat orders. Western media has largely celebrated this development as evidence of Ukrainian military success and Russian weakness. Headlines speak of territorial gains and momentum shifting of Russia's diminishing capacity to sustain its war effort. On the surface, the narrative is straightforward. Russia is losing. But there's a paradox embedded in this story that most analysis misses entirely. Russia doesn't retreat when it's winning in the long term. Russia retreats strategically when it's preparing for something else entirely. Consider the actual situation. Russia is simultaneously losing territory while strengthening its position. This isn't a contradiction, it's a calculated shift in the nature of the competition itself. Because here's what's critical to understand. The real battlefield isn't on the map anymore. It's in energy markets. It's in European political capitals. It's in the attention span of American voters. It's in the delicate architecture of NATO itself, the alliance that has held Europe stable for over 70 years. When Russia pulls back from fortified positions, it's not admitting defeat. It's consolidating forces. It's testing NATO cohesion. It's watching precisely which European allies will blink first when winter arrives and energy becomes scarce. It's calculating exactly how long the American public will sustain interest in a distant conflict while domestic crises mount at home. This is the hidden story. The question isn't whether Russia lost this particular round. The real question is far more consequential. What is Russia preparing to win in the next round? And perhaps more importantly, is the West even paying attention to the right battlefield? Russian forces across multiple sectors of the Ukrainian front have executed coordinated withdrawals from positions they had held and invested significant resources in defending. These weren't chaotic retreats forced by overwhelming Ukrainian advances. They were organized movements, supplies, relocated systematically forces, consolidated and repositioned command structures maintained throughout the process. The distinction matters enormously. A panicked withdrawal looks entirely different from a strategic repositioning, and what we've observed aligns much more closely with the latter. What makes these withdrawals strategically significant is their selectivity. Russia didn't abandon positions uniformly across all fronts. Instead, Russian forces have maintained or reinforced positions in areas of critical strategic value, particularly territories controlling energy infrastructure corridors, major transportation networks, and regions with significant industrial capacity. The pattern reveals clear prioritization. Russia retreated from some positions while defending others with apparent determination. This wasn't indiscriminate pullback, it was calculated consolidation. Russian military statements have consistently framed these movements as regrouping and consolidation operations. Moscow's official narrative emphasizes that forces are being repositioned to strengthen defensive positions in other sectors. Western officials initially dismissed these claims as transparent propaganda, but the actual pattern of Russian behavior suggests the explanation wasn't entirely false, merely incomplete. Russia was telling part of the truth while obscuring the larger strategic calculation. The timing of these movements proves crucial. They occurred during a specific window when American political attention faced competing demands. Domestic elections approaching escalations in the Middle East, consuming diplomatic resources, economic concerns dominating domestic politics. NATO was simultaneously navigating questions about long-term Ukraine support commitments. European public opinion on continued military assistance to Ukraine showed visible signs of fatigue, particularly as energy costs remained elevated and inflation persisted across the continent. This convergence of factors, American distraction, European hesitation, NATO coordination challenges public war weariness, created a particular strategic environment. Russia's movements occurred precisely when the Western coalition faced maximum internal pressure and minimum unified focus. The timing appears deliberate, not accidental. Understanding what happened on the battlefield, however, only addresses half the question. The more consequential issue is understanding why Russia would execute these specific moves at this particular moment. That requires looking beyond the immediate military situation to the historical patterns that have consistently guided Russian strategic thinking. To understand what Russia is doing now, we need to recognize a consistent pattern that has shaped Russian military strategy for decades. Russian strategic thinking, inherited from Soviet doctrine and refined through contemporary experience, operates on a fundamentally different time horizon than Western military planning. While American and European militaries typically optimize for decisive victories within defined operational periods, Russian strategy optimizes for sustained leverage across extended time horizons. This distinction explains why Russian retreats often precede periods of Russian strength. Consider Georgia in 2008. Russian forces withdrew from certain positions while simultaneously consolidating control over critical infrastructure and establishing frozen conflict zones that have served Russian interests indefinitely. The initial retreat looked like Russian defeat. A decade later, Russia maintained leverage over Georgia's political future without sustaining ongoing military costs. The strategy worked across a timeline of years, not months. Syria presents a similar case study. Russia entered the conflict with limited military forces compared to the scale of the American presence in Iraq or Afghanistan. Rather than attempting to match American military capacity, Russia established key strategic positions, air bases, naval facilities, intelligence networks. From these limited positions, Russia exercised influence far beyond what its military footprint would suggest possible. Russia didn't win in Syria in the traditional sense. Russia positioned itself to remain relevant in Syria's future, regardless of how the immediate conflict resolved. That was the actual objective. This reveals the critical insight. Russian strategy often operates simultaneously across multiple time horizons. What appears as defeat in the immediate term can represent brilliant positioning for the medium and long term. A territorial withdrawal that looks disastrous in month 1 can appear strategically prescient in month 12 if it was always part of a larger calculation. Western analysis often fails to account for this temporal dimension, treating military movements as discrete events rather than as elements of extended strategic sequences. Russia has also historically used strategic retreats as deliberate tests of opponent cohesion. During the Cold War, apparent Soviet concessions frequently preceded pressure campaigns that exploited divisions within Western alliances. The pattern repeated consistently: withdraw from positions that became untenable, carefully observe how opponents respond to the retreat, identify fracture lines in coalition unity, then apply concentrated pressure precisely at those fracture points. The retreat itself was the diagnostic tool, a way to discover where alliance unity was weakest. Additionally, Russia has repeatedly used military drawdowns as cover for escalating economic pressure. Energy weaponization, sanctions, evasion mechanisms, currency manipulation, and commodity market leverage are often deployed simultaneously with military repositioning rather than sequentially. During Soviet détente periods in the 1970s, Moscow presented itself as militarily cooperative while systematically expanding economic ties and influence through asymmetric means. The public narrative emphasized military restraint while hidden leverage accumulated beneath the surface. Finally, Russia has demonstrated consistent expertise in exploiting temporal windows when opponents face competing demands. During the Georgia conflict, international attention was consumed by the 2008 financial crisis. Early Ukraine interventions occurred while Western militaries remained heavily committed to Iraq and Afghanistan. Russia's strategic timing targets moments when potential opponents have maximum internal distraction and minimum unified focus capacity. Russia watches for these windows and moves precisely when they open. Understanding this pattern of Russian behavior transforms how we interpret current events. It suggests that current retreats should be understood not as isolated tactical developments, but as potential elements within a longer strategic sequence whose full scope remains hidden from immediate view. The hidden strategic story operates across 4 interconnected dimensions, each reinforcing the others. Together, they explain not merely what Russia is doing, but why Russia would execute these specific moves at this particular moment. Understanding these dimensions requires moving beyond battlefield analysis into the deeper terrain of economic pressure alliance politics and extended strategic calculation. Start with the military dimension. Russia's frontline retreats enable force consolidation and redeployment toward positions of substantially higher strategic value. Rather than maintaining dispersed positions across the vast Ukrainian territory, Russia concentrates forces in areas where they can exercise disproportionate leverage, particularly territories controlling energy infrastructure, water resources, and critical transportation corridors. This concentration increases force efficiency while simultaneously reducing logistical requirements. In a conflict where attrition matters more than territorial control, this repositioning materially extends Russian staying power. Russia can sustain pressure longer with concentrated, efficient forces than it could with dispersed positions requiring constant logistical supply. Simultaneously, the retreats provide operational cover for internal military reorganization that would otherwise appear as vulnerability. Russia is likely rotating fatigued forces, conducting training on newer equipment systems, and restructuring command arrangements that have proven inefficient during extended operations. By framing this necessary reorganization as strategic retreat rather than as internal reform, Russia maintains unified public narrative and preserves strategic messaging. The retreat explains force movements that might otherwise suggest disarray. But this is only the visible dimension. The real strategic calculation emerges at the economic level, which is where the actual pressure campaign operates. As Russia consolidates military positions, it simultaneously tightens economic leverage on Europe. Energy supplies, grain exports, fertilizer availability, and rare earth material flows become pressure instruments. The timing proves crucial. Russia deploys these economic weapons precisely as European support for Ukraine faces mounting domestic political pressure from elevated energy costs and persistent inflation. This creates a paradoxical situation for Western policymakers. European governments can claim military progress, Ukrainian territorial gains, Russian withdrawal from positions. Simultaneously, their populations experience intensifying economic pressure. Winter energy crises, continued commodity shortages, industrial constraints from energy limitations. The mismatch between military and economic indicators fractures alliance cohesion. Citizens observe their government celebrating military victories while their living standards deteriorate. This disconnect becomes politically destabilizing. Russia is also exploiting this period to deepen economic relationships with nations positioned outside Western sanctions architecture. India, Southeast Asian nations, Middle Eastern states become alternative markets and financial channels. These relationships reduce the impact of Western sanctions while increasing Russia's economic flexibility. Russia develops workarounds that sustain its economy even under isolation. The long-term effect, Western sanctions prove less effective than anticipated, while Russia's economic resilience exceeds expectations. The third dimension targets alliance cohesion directly. Russia's retreat pattern functions as deliberate probing for fracture lines within NATO. By withdrawing militarily while maintaining economic pressure, Russia creates conditions where different NATO members face radically different cost-benefit calculations. Energy-dependent European nations, Germany, Italy, Central Europe, experience different pressures than maritime-focused allies like Poland or the Baltics. Countries with large Russian diaspora populations face different domestic political constraints than others. This differentiation is intentional. Russia essentially runs a diagnostic test. How much economic pain will European publics tolerate for Ukraine's support? Where is the breaking point for particular nations? Which alliance members might be tempted toward separate negotiations? These answers will determine Russia's strategy in subsequent phases. The retreats function as a pressure test, exposing alliance weaknesses that can later be exploited with precision. The timing also matters for American commitment. If American attention remains divided between Ukraine-Middle East escalations and domestic concerns, the cost of American reassurance to nervous European allies increases substantially. Russia may deliberately be creating conditions where European NATO members feel compelled to seek independent accommodations, with Russia weakening collective alliance architecture. A fragmented alliance is far easier to pressure than a unified one. Finally, the diplomatic dimension. Military retreats create space for diplomatic overtures that appear reasonable to international audiences. Russia proposes negotiations from a position that seems to demonstrate military restraint. These aren't genuine peace proposals. They're positioning moves designed to test whether Western unity holds and whether specific nations might be interested in separate negotiations. Russia discovers which European leaders might be willing to negotiate separately, which ones prioritize domestic stability over alliance commitments. Diplomatic retreats also serve information warfare objectives. Retreat narratives allow Russian messaging to claim that Russia respects negotiated settlements and demonstrates restraint. This creates cognitive dissonance in Western audiences. Russian intentions become ambiguous rather than clearly hostile. Perceptions gradually shift regarding what constitutes reasonable Russian behavior. What makes this moment strategically significant is that all four dimensions reinforce each other in an integrated sequence. Military consolidation enables sustained economic pressure. Economic pressure tests alliance cohesion. Alliance testing creates diplomatic opportunities. Diplomatic openings appear more reasonable when Russia has made apparent military concessions. Each dimension amplifies the others. This is how Russia wins without winning territorially. The objective isn't conquest. It's creating conditions where the Western alliance becomes progressively less unified, where European nations begin calculating separate interests, where the cost of supporting Ukraine gradually exceeds the perceived benefit. This is strategy through gradual erosion rather than through decisive military victory. Russia's strategic repositioning doesn't simply represent a military adjustment in Ukraine. It represents a fundamental transfer of the competition from the military domain, where the West maintains substantial advantages, into domains where Russia possesses greater structural leverage: energy markets, financial systems, alliance cohesion, and information warfare. Understanding this shift is essential to recognizing what's actually at stake. For Europe, the immediate stakes increase dramatically. Russia's strategy forces European nations toward a choice that isn't explicitly presented but emerges inevitably from structural pressure. Continue supporting Ukraine at escalating domestic political cost, or seek accommodation with Russia to reduce economic pressure. This choice becomes concrete and personal, not abstract. Winter energy availability, inflation rates, and industrial production cease being policy abstractions. They become lived experience. A European voter experiencing elevated heating bills, reduced industrial employment, and uncertainty about next winter's energy supply begins calculating differently than a voter observing these issues from distance. As the cost of Ukraine support becomes visible in household energy bills and employment rates, political pressure on European governments intensifies substantially. Some European leaders will inevitably conclude that a negotiated settlement, which would require Ukrainian concessions, represents a preferable alternative to continued conflict with sustained economic consequences. This creates genuine fracture potential within NATO itself. If certain European members begin independent negotiations with Russia, or if energy desperation drives them toward Russian economic accommodation, the unified Western response to Ukraine disintegrates. Russia doesn't require military victory over Ukraine. Russia only requires peeling away European support, fragmenting the coalition that sustained Ukraine's resistance. A Ukraine without European backing cannot sustain indefinite resistance, regardless of its military capabilities. For American strategy, Russia's repositioning creates pressure at precisely the moment American capacity to sustain commitment is most constrained. The United States confronts competing demands simultaneously: sustained financial and military support for Ukraine, escalating Middle East crises, domestic political polarization that erodes bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. American attention is fractured across multiple theaters. Russia's calculation targets this exact vulnerability. If American support falters, European support becomes isolated and ultimately unsustainable. Russia bets that American attention span and political will have natural limits, and that exploiting those limits will fracture the Western response. The calculation isn't that America will deliberately abandon Ukraine. It's that America will become too distracted by competing crises to maintain the level of commitment Ukraine's situation requires. The effect is identical. Global commodity markets face structural shifts. Russia's economic repositioning involves developing alternative export channels and supply relationships outside Western sanctions architecture. This doesn't reverse sanctions themselves, but it does create effective workarounds that reduce their impact while simultaneously deepening Russia's ties to non-Western economic partners: India, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Africa. More consequentially, Russia's successful navigation around sanctions while maintaining economic leverage through energy and commodity control demonstrates a model that other sanctioned states will likely emulate. China, Iran, North Korea observe Russia's methods and adapt them to their own circumstances. Over time, this could fundamentally reshape global trade patterns, reducing the effectiveness of sanctions as a policy instrument and creating parallel economic systems less integrated with Western financial architecture. The entire sanctions regime, a cornerstone of Western strategy, becomes progressively less effective. For alliance architecture, the implications prove even more fundamental. NATO's deterrent strength depends entirely on unified commitment to collective defense. If that commitment becomes conditional based on economic calculation, if some members prioritize energy security or economic interest over collective defense, NATO transitions from a security institution to a political coalition where individual members maintain effective veto power based on national interest. This doesn't necessarily destroy NATO. It fundamentally transforms NATO's character and reduces its deterrent value substantially. Ukraine's long-term situation becomes precarious regardless of tactical military success. Even if Ukraine holds militarily, economic exhaustion of European support creates irresistible political pressure for negotiated settlement. A militarily successful Ukraine lacking sustained Western support cannot consolidate territorial gains or resist future Russian pressure. Military victory becomes hollow if the political will sustaining it evaporates. Finally, the broader implications for global competition demand recognition. If Russia successfully demonstrates that economic leverage and alliance pressure can achieve strategic objectives without decisive military victory, it establishes a model challenging fundamental assumptions about great power competition. This suggests that control of critical commodities, energy, and supply chains may matter more than military capability, a shift with profound implications for how China, India, and other rising powers calculate their strategic approaches. The ripples extend far beyond Ukraine, reshaping the architecture of global order itself. Russia's strategic repositioning opens multiple possible futures. None of them are predetermined. Each depends on specific choices and developments that remain genuinely uncertain. Understanding these scenarios helps identify the critical variables that will determine which future actually emerges. The first scenario involves gradual European fracture. Russia's economic pressure progressively erodes European support for Ukraine over an extended period. Winter energy crises create genuine hardship for European populations, not catastrophic collapse, but sustained difficulty. Energy bills remain elevated. Industrial production faces constraints from energy limitations. Unemployment rises modestly as energy-intensive industries reduce operations or relocate production outside Europe. This creates political vulnerability for European leaders maintaining strong Ukraine support. Far-right and far-left political parties, which frequently oppose Ukraine assistance, gain electoral strength across multiple countries. Some European leaders quietly begin exploring accommodation with Russia, offering potential sanctions relief in exchange for energy agreements. These explorations remain unofficial and deniable initially, but they gradually establish channels for negotiation. By early to mid-2025, one or more European NATO members significantly reduces military support for Ukraine while increasing economic engagement with Russia. This creates precedent and reduces the political cost of accommodation. Other NATO members face mounting domestic pressure to follow. Ukraine, confronting reduced external support, finds itself forced toward negotiated settlement from a position of weakness, likely ceding significant territory. The second scenario envisions Western coalition stabilization. The West recognizes Russia's strategy explicitly and responds with deliberate countermeasures. Instead of allowing energy to remain a pressure point, Western nations implement emergency energy efficiency programs, accelerate renewable energy deployment, and develop strategic reserves. American leadership forcefully reaffirms commitment to Ukraine and NATO, creating bipartisan domestic consensus that sustains support despite competing priorities. European leaders communicate clearly to their populations that economic costs represent temporary sacrifice necessary for preserving European security architecture. Military support for Ukraine continues at levels sufficient to prevent Russian territorial gains. The conflict transforms into prolonged stalemate where neither side achieves decisive advantage. Russia's economic leverage persists, but fails to fracture the coalition. European publics gradually adjust to elevated energy costs as the new normal. The conflict becomes a long-term competition of attrition where Western economic capacity eventually prevails. The third scenario involves negotiated settlement with frozen conflict. Both Russia and the West recognize that neither side can achieve decisive victory within acceptable cost parameters. A negotiated settlement emerges, allowing Russia to retain significant Ukrainian territory while stopping short of complete conquest. The settlement creates frozen conflict zones similar to previous post-Soviet arrangements. Territorial issues remain unresolved, but active military hostilities cease. This leaves fundamental questions unresolved and creates potential for renewed conflict, but it ends immediate warfare. The fourth scenario, least probable but carrying highest stakes, involves escalation toward great power confrontation. Russia's strategy fails to fracture the Western coalition. Frustrated by lack of progress, Russia escalates through cyber attacks on NATO infrastructure, energy infrastructure sabotage, or military moves that provoke direct NATO response. This creates potential for NATO-Russia confrontation that neither side desires but finds difficult to prevent. Escalation spirals become possible, miscalculation risks increase substantially. Several critical variables will heavily influence which scenario emerges. American domestic politics and whether Ukraine's support remains bipartisan matter enormously. Specific leaders occupying key positions in Berlin, Paris, Washington will make choices that shift probabilities. Energy market developments and global supply conditions prove crucial. Military technology developments affecting battlefield dynamics matter. Unexpected events, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, regional conflicts elsewhere could shift attention and priorities dramatically. The next 12 months constitute a critical period. Decisions being made now, some publicly, many privately, are already determining probabilities. The future remains genuinely uncertain, but it's being shaped by choices occurring in this precise moment.